What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review episode 6 of season 2 of The Lord of the Rings of Power, where the good news is we're almost finished here. We've got 2 more episodes to go, and then we can take a nice long break from discussing The Lord of the Rings of Power. But just as a way of starting off this video on a positive note, what I will say is that because of this show, I've been reading a lot more J.R.R. Tolkien recently. I've been rereading his Unfinished Tales, which it's almost like an appendices to the appendices, where all the scraps and story beats and characters that didn't quite make it into The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion, he explores them or embellishes them, or oftentimes you'll almost kind of see different versions of different stories and how they kind of led to the final product. But I feel like this is like the niches of the niche of the very end of the long tail, but well worth a look. But also, as a result of this show, I decided to finally pull the trigger and buy the hardback edition of Beren and Luthien, which is basically like a more fleshed out version of the Beren and Luthien story that was already presented in the Silmarillion. And for a lot of people, that is the most interesting story in the first age in the Silmarillion. I mean, it's got love, it's got Sauron, it's got Morgoth, it's got werewolves. I mean, it's got all kinds of crazy shit. It is a true tale of high adventure. And after a couple of weeks of enduring the absolutely horrific writing of The Lord of the Rings of Power, when you actually read the words of J.R.R. Tolkien, it's like they come off the page like music. I mean, this episode committed the ultimate sin of reusing the worst line from season 1, "The sea is always right." And I find it very revealing that nobody working on this show has paused for self-reflection and just thought to themselves, maybe some of these lines that we thought had so much weight and gravitas in season 1, maybe they're just pure shit and we should just let them go. But no, Elendil says that line again, and it just shows how any hope people might be nursing for course correction or at the show will kind of inevitably find its footing. People keep saying, oh, well, like Star Trek The Next Generation had a kind of sort of weak season 1, but by the end of season 2, it had found firm footing. This show is never going to find firm footing. If they think the sea is always right is some great poetic line that just communicates all this wisdom and gravitas, well then it just shows that they are living in complete and total denial over what their final product has finally turned out to be. In any case, if you take a break from the show and actually read some of the text written by J.R.R. Tolkien, it has this wonderful effect of kind of like burning away all the horrible memories of watching this show. It's a little bit like the Silmarils and the Silmarillion, where like even if Morgoth, who's like this all-powerful demonic entity, even when he's holding on to the Silmarils, they kind of have a way of like burning through his hand and scarring him. Like the light's too bright. And I feel like the work of J.R.R. Tolkien has the effect of the Silmarils, where it kind of burns away the Lord of the Rings of Power, and just reminds us that this show is absolutely just a shit stain left at the bottom of the toilet after a particularly gruesome experience in the bathroom. And I think in a few years' time, people will have just kind of forgotten this experience entirely. They can just wash the taste of it out of their mouths and get back to enjoying the astonishing books of J.R.R. Tolkien. But let's get serious for a second and try and break down and dissect, why does this show feel like it's just stuck in the mud with no momentum whatsoever? And I think the answer is obvious. You have this giant cast of characters with all these largely independent storylines going in different directions, where just like 8 episodes, it's not enough time for all these storylines to like yield all the dividends that they should. Like the stories taking place on Numenor, quite literally taking place on an island unto itself, totally independent from the rest of the story, and they need to find a way to intertwine these stories, or like devote an entire season just to Numenor and wrap that shit up, or devote an entire season to the stories over in Rhûn and wrap that shit up. But it's like every time a story gets going, it's like, oh, but now we got to go see Nori and Poppy and see what the fuck they're up to. Like, Poppy kissing a boy and talking about how like his breath smells like lizards. I mean, it is some of the dumbest fucking shit that I've ever seen. And it's just an absolute waste of screen time. Or Gandalf, not Gandalf, aka the Stranger, whoever the hell he turns out to be, a blue wizard. Like, it doesn't even matter at this point. But for like years at this point, they've been like, trying to squeeze every drop of mystery out of that storyline they can. And he's still looking for a staff or looking for a stick. I do not care about Gandalf's plight, looking for a proper stick in a field full of sticks, getting advice from Tom Bombadil. And speaking of which, let me interrupt my rant about too many characters and too little structure to call attention to yet another problem: repurposing lines of dialogue. And this episode gave us the absolute motherload. It had a small one early on where Poppy said something stupid that was very reminiscent of Sam saying that there's some good in this world and it's worth fighting for.
But there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
like, all right, that's a small sin. Let's overlook it. But then it had the goddamn gall to have Tom Bombadil stealing one of Gandalf's lines from the Fellowship of the Ring and then, spewing it out to the stranger, a.k.a. not Gandalf, basically saying like, oh, well, the reason he says this to Frodo in the Mines of Moria in the Peter Jackson movies is because he first heard this line from Tom Bombadil.
Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment.
But to be perfectly clear, to be perfectly accurate, that line about people living that deserve death or dying that deserve life actually comes from the chapter The Shadow of the Past when the Lord of the Rings, and the original scene proceeds as such. Unlike in that scene in the Mines of Moria and the Fellowship of the Ring, this scene comes in the context of Gandalf and Frodo discussing Gollum, and Frodo says, now at any rate, he's as bad as an orc and just an enemy. He deserves death, to which Gandalf replies, deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment. And at any rate, so it comes from The Shadow of the Past, an early chapter in the Fellowship of the Ring, but it's like the way they used it in the Fellowship of the Ring, the movie, I thought was kind of brilliant because they found this great passage from early in the book that would give that, I guess, that moment between Gandalf and Frodo, unexpected tenderness. And then we hear that line kind of echoed again at the very end when Frodo's like, about to set out on his own. Anyway, I felt like The Fellowship of the Ring is one of the best adaptations of Tolkien's work. But I've said it before in previous videos, and I'll say it again here now, but the show has a weird problem where it doesn't adapt what text there is available for the Second Age. What it does, it steals scenes from Peter Jackson's trilogy, makes a slight alteration, and then drops them into the Second Age where they don't fit or they don't have any context or they just have no relevance, almost as if any story that takes place in the world of Middle-earth is going to have the same character beats and the same story beats and the same lines of dialogue. And it's like, no, there's a different story that's told in the Second Age from the Third Age. Stop stealing scenes and stop stealing characters from the Third Age and dropping them into the Second Age. It's almost as if they believe the audience won't be satisfied with just a story about the Second Age with the material provided by J.R.R. Tolkien, but like it needs to have Balrogs and Ents and Hobbits and wizards and all these things that were not there in the Second Age. And it just absolutely drives me crazy because J.R.R. Tolkien did provide an outline for the Second Age and the appendices, which Amazon got the rights to, and I'm just going to reread a little section from the appendices just to remind people of what the official sequence of events is, because with the invasion of Eregion, they are kind of doing everything out of order, and I just want to remind people what the proper order actually is. So we're going to start in the year 1200 in the Second Age, and if things seem to be slightly out of order in comparison to the show, it's because the show keeps fucking it up. But in the year 1200, Sauron endeavors to seduce the Eldar. Gil-galad refuses to treat with them, but the smiths of Eregion are won over. The Númenóreans begin to make permanent havens. The elven smiths instructed by Sauron reach the height of their skill. Now, circa 1500, 300 years later, they begin the forging of the Rings of Power. Then in circa 1590, the 3 rings are completed in Eregion. Sauron forges the 1 ring in Orodurin. He completes the Barad-dûr, and then circa 1600, Celebrimbor perceives the designs of Sauron. Then in the year 1693, 93 years later, War of the Elves and Sauron begins. The 3 rings are hidden. 1695, Sauron's forces invade Eriador. Gil-galad sends Elrond to Eregion. Eregion laid waste. Death of Celebrimbor. The gates of Moria are shut. And it almost breaks my brain trying to discuss when, where, and how this show is going wrong, because it does so little right, if anything, I mean, maybe nothing, that there's no like foundation to stand upon. So, like if they got the central storyline more or less accurate, but then you can say, oh, well, I kind of don't like what they did here, or I don't like what they did there. But when everything's fundamentally broken at its core, it's like, all right, well, like, what the fuck are we even doing here? But anyway, my brief little Middle-earth history lesson is over. Let's dive into some specifics from the episode. And my first note that I've written down for this episode is, at least no Theo this episode. I mean, I don't want to pick on the child actor playing that role, but if that character were to get, swallowed by an orc, I don't think anybody would cry on his behalf. But we get a little bit of Arondir at the beginning where he's having a fight with some orcs, and this show is yet another problem during the combat where people are doing all this stupid spinny shit and all this elaborate choreography, but the weapons never actually encounter their target. It's like someone and somebody standing 10 feet away is like, oh, you got me. Like, show somebody getting fucking stabbed, like when Aragorn is fighting Lurtz in the Fellowship of the Ring. And hacking off his limbs and stabbing him. Like, all right, Aragorn is fighting that Uruk-hai. I believe it. I can feel it. It's visceral. It's intense. The fights in this show are the exact opposite. They remind me of a lot of the kind of like lackluster lightsaber battles in some of the Disney Star Wars shows. And speaking of Disney Star Wars, this show is almost at the level of Star Wars The Acolyte, with some of the stupid singing bullshit that Disa indulges in later in this episode. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm going to take all my complaints in order. All right, here's another one of my major complaints. We get a lot of scenes this episode between Adar and Galadriel, and she's always trying so hard to look so severe and so tough that she actually accomplishes the exact opposite. It's like like a child having a temper tantrum. But at one point, Adar says to her, "It is said the 3 elven rings save the elves from fading." It's like, who says this? Like, when someone says, "It is said," well, then somebody has to be saying it like this just happened. Like, how would the entire world at large, especially people that are not interacting with the elves on a daily basis, already be saying, "Oh, it is said the 3 elven rings save the elves from fading"? Anyway, it's a little bit like how everybody suddenly knows about the existence of Mordor, in spite of the fact that Mordor, in the context of this show, is also a fairly recent, like, new phenomenon. Like, there's no internet, there are no newspapers. Like, news travels slowly in Middle Earth. It's either traveling on horseback or on foot, and it takes months to get around, but somehow everybody in the show seems to know everything that's happening in all the corners of Middle Earth simultaneously. It's totally ridiculous. Like, think back to Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy, when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli first encounter the Riders of Rohan and Eomer, and one of the things they ask is, like, what news do you have? And that's the way news is exchanged. Like, you travel and you bump into people and say, like, what's going on? But, like, they're totally blissfully unaware of the fact that, like, there's this brewing civil war, and they're going to have to choose sides, help Theoden overcome Sauron, and fight at the Battle of Helm's Deep, etc., and so forth. But I like how they kind of stumble into this giant civil war, this giant subplot that's already halfway through, and they've been blissfully unaware this whole time because news travels slowly in Middle Earth, but not in the show The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. But getting back to these scenes between Adar and Galadriel, they're trying to turn the crown of Morgoth into somehow like the secret weapon that can kill Sauron. All this shit is made up for this show. Like, the crown of Morgoth is actually an important item in the First Age because it's like this big, thick, heavy crown into which Morgoth embeds the 3 Silmarils after he steals them. For people who have not read the Silmarillion, the reason it's called the Silmarillion is because Morgoth steals these 3 Silmarils created by Feanor, retreats back to Middle-earth, and all the elves decide that they're going to travel back to Middle-earth from the Undying Lands and take it back. And it's basically the beginning of like this, like the long defeat, as it's often described. And it takes thousands of years across the First Age and the Second Age. And one of the most interesting stories involving the Crown of Morgoth is when Beren and Luthien traveled to his castle, put him to sleep, and managed to chisel out one of the Silmarils from his crown, and everybody goes berserk trying to get it after the fact. Anyway, I don't want to get too distracted talking about the Silmarillion, but if anybody ever wanted to make just like a kick-ass epic movie about the story of Beren and Luthien, oh my god, like that story would be so fucking cool. But the Crown of Morgoth, it's a major item. It has nothing to do though with like making secret weapons to kill Sauron. It's total bullshit. But another storyline this episode, which I was not too fond of, is the attempted execution of Elendil for being a traitor. And at the last second, Muriel says, "Well, he was acting on my behalf. I'm going to be sacrificed." Blah blah blah. But like this whole idea of sacrificing people to sea monsters as a way for the Valar to kind of like render a judgment. Also, 100% made up for the show. You can tell that some of the writers on this show, they just saw Clash of the Titans one too many times. Like, well, we don't know how to write fantasy or mythology, so we're just going to continue to borrow from other myths, other stories, and not even try to disguise it. And the Kraken, if you will, just basically decides to vomit Muriel back onto the shore. And everybody's like, oh, the sea is always right. The line, "the sea is always right," reminds me a little bit of the line from Halloween Kills, "Evil dies tonight." And for some reason, they kind of rhyme. So maybe, here's my conspiracy theory, maybe some of the dumbasses writing this show love Halloween Kills and don't realize that movie is a giant stinking pile of dog shit. And like, well, that line, "Evil dies tonight," it just has a nice ring to it. So we're going to have our own version with "the sea is always right." Anyway, there is an absolute epidemic of terrible writing in the world of Hollywood these days, and I feel like, Halloween Kills and The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power are the poster children for terrible writing. But I've already mentioned some of my complaints with the story taking place in Rune this episode, but one last thing on that front. Tom Bombadil should give zero fucks about this struggle. One of the things that makes Tom Bombadil so interesting is that he's utterly unconcerned with all the horrors taking place in Middle Earth. over the millennia, he just wants to hang around and sing his songs and like pluck flowers and sing songs to his wife and that sort of thing. He's not a grand mastermind helping people, like achieve their destiny and that sort of thing. It's like the complete and total opposite of what Tom Bombadil should be is how he's characterized in this show. So hopefully this is the last we will see of him in this show. But yeah, for everybody saying like, oh, but they're going to put Tom Bombadil on the show. Like the show is saved. They figured it out. Yeah, it was just a complete and total embarrassing failure. I guess the best stuff with this episode, and I'm going to put best in quotation marks, or like the least loathsome storyline this episode, is watching Anatar, a.k.a. Sauron's attempts to continue to kind of like pull the wool over Celebrimbor's eyes so that he'll finish constructing the 9 rings for mortal men. And he's using illusions, and he's using lies and deception, and basically doing everything in his power to keep Celebrimbor working, etc. and so forth. I mean, that stuff, I wasn't like, projectile vomiting out of my nose as it was unfolding. So once again, it was the best stuff this episode, but not particularly good. And once again, this show has a teleportation problem where Anatar just teleports to Khazad-dûm, says he needs some more mithril. Durin turns him down, but Anatar manages to score a small stash, retreats back to Eregion so they can resume the forging of those 9 rings. But back in Khazad-dûm, the 2 Durins have a fight when Durin tries to persuade his father to remove the Ring of Power. And also the Dwarven rings that look like something that comes out of like a Cracker Jack box. I mean, they look totally ridiculous, but his father, like, whoa, like, shoves him across the room, and he goes off with Disa to wage his own private civil war to try to like prevent people from mining deeper. It's like I'm sorry, Disa and her stupid little songs to summon bats are not going to be able to keep, an army of dwarves at bay if King Durin is hell-bent upon digging deeper, because he's recognizing that there is war on the horizon, the price for all these precious materials is going to go up, and he's stalling for better offers before, surrendering any of the rare ores that they're mining down below. But when Disa started singing that fucking song to summon the bats, I mean, I just started cracking up. It's almost like, am I laughing at the show, or am I laughing at myself for being such a dumbass to commit so much time to this show? As I'm fond of saying, I watched this show so other people wouldn't have to. But she just explodes in this burst of singing, and the first thing that came to my mind was, I think, episode 3 of Star Wars: The Acolyte, when people are doing like those, like they're just like, those, I don't know how, like writhing in ecstasy, the power of 1, the power of 2, and all that crap. In addition to the bad writing that's plaguing Hollywood, the terrible music is also plaguing Hollywood. And if you want an example of the terrible music plaguing Hollywood and this show specifically, listen to the music that plays during the closing credits for any episode, this episode included. It's some of the worst music ever composed, and if you compare that to the music written by Howard Shore for the original Peter Jackson trilogy, I mean that the music in that trilogy was just bone-chilling. Like the song at the end of the 2 Towers, I mean, it's like a knife like being like scraped down your spine. You're like, oh my God, this is evil and beautiful and chilling. Anyway, it set a very high bar. The music in this show is shit. But just as a way of wrapping up this video on a mildly positive note, I like the fact that they at least made a reference to Feanor and the 3 Silmarils this episode. And basically, it's Anatar's way of wooing Celebrimbor, saying, like, you'll be regarded as an even greater smith than Feanor. If you want to know about Feanor, check out the Silmarillion. I mean, like the Silmarillion has a slow beginning for like the first like 30 or 40 pages where it's almost like a new Old Testament for the creation of the world, but it doesn't really get interesting until Feanor creates the 3 Silmarils, and he's just like, he's the greatest smith that the elves have ever produced. But he's not necessarily the nicest person. He's kind of proud and arrogant. But when Morgoth steals the Silmarils, that's really what is like the catalyst for all the action of the story. And that's when the book gets really fucking good. But maybe the reference to Feanor and the 3 Silmarils this episode might encourage some people who are kind of blindly adoring the show without realizing just how bad it is. That might encourage them to go back and read the Silmarillion. And that's one of those books where it's so dense and it's so rich in its lore and it's so complex, you can basically reread it every couple of years and just fall in love with it all over again. So, yeah, long story short, if you like this show, I guess the good news is, like, the best is yet to come because you have not yet read the Silmarillion and you don't realize just how good Tolkien can be when it comes to the First and the Second Age. So that's my way of wrapping things up. Read more J.R.R. Tolkien books, which I feel like that is a piece of advice that will age well in any era. Whether we're seeing good adaptations or bad adaptations, always go back to the text and you can do no wrong. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Am I being too nice? Am I being too harsh? Am I being just right in my criticisms? I'd love to hear from y'all. So please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. And also, if you're looking for a cool movie to see in the theater, go see The Substance. I know I spent a lot of time on this channel talking shit about terrible movies and terrible shows. I really enjoyed The Substance, and yeah, it is my most recent video before this one, so check out my review on this channel. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks so much for watching, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.